Good morning, everyone. This is Brian Henry with your Predictive Services NMAC Long-Term Fire Weather Outlook. We're going to take a look at the early part of the fire season going into June and July. And this presentation was made on March 31st, but is valid for the April 1st outlook. Taking a look at the recent history over the past 5 or 6 years, you can see the acreage burned and the number of fires each year. Where are we going to shake out for 2020? That's a pretty good question to ask. My best guess, based upon the information that I'll show you in this presentation, is that it'll be somewhere in the middle, probably overall slightly above average for both number of fires and acres burned. Looking at the primary factors that impact fire season across the West, we start back generally at what happened the previous fall, and we talked about this several times in previous discussions, that the fall precipitation along the West Coast was well above average. The soil moisture values got to be quite dry. Snowpack accrual overall was pretty good for the most part across the winter. We'll see on the maps that along the Continental Divide and along the Canadian border, snowpack values were near average or maybe even above average in some spots. The Alaska interior had snowpack that was well above average, but there were some areas of concern that we've been monitoring through the late winter and early spring across Oregon and California. We're also starting to get a little bit of information regarding how the monsoon may shake out in the Southwest this year. We're expecting an average monsoon that begins right around average as far as the time goes in early July. The monsoon could have some surges in it that are above average as far for convection, and that could be a little bit problematic as those storms move northward into the Great Basin and northern Rockies, Pacific Northwest, and northern California. The next thing that's up to monitor is the spring factor. The spring factor is basically how quickly do we warm up and how warm does it get. Right now, the first half of April appears to be cooler and wetter than average across much of the West. So that's going to actually allow for us to accumulate a little bit more snowfall in the mountains, but the long-range data is starting to point towards a pretty significant shift in the patterns beginning in mid to late April and or early May towards a warm and dry pattern that will persist through the middle and latter spring. That will accelerate the mountain snowpack, and we could see an early loss of the snowpack, which could be a little bit problematic. The next thing that'll be up to bat after that will be what kind of temperatures and precipitation do we observe in June and July. Right now, again, the long-range data points to warmer and drier than average conditions, which sets the stage for an active fire season. And of course, the wild card out there is what are the impacts from the coronavirus going to be on resources and other things. Taking a look at the mountain snowpack across the West, you can see on this map that it's one of the better years. Southwestern Oregon continues to be below average, as does portions of southern Idaho and the Sierra. However, all three of these areas are showing improvement with a change to the cool wet pattern, but probably are likely going to finish below average for the snow season, at least in the high Sierra in California. Oregon, there's an outside chance you could catch up, as could southern Idaho. Keep in mind that underneath all this, we do have some lingering drought stress from last fall across portions of central and northern California and western Oregon. So underneath the snowpack in a lot of these spots, especially in southwestern Oregon, that soil is quite dry. So that could become impactful to us as we make that transition into fire season during the early part of the summer. Taking a look at Alaska. Not much has changed from what we've been looking at over the past few months. The Kenai Peninsula and the Mat-Su Valley continue to be below average on snowpack and will finish below average on snowpack. The interior, however, in southeast Alaska are going to be above average on their final values, and they are expecting a melting rate that is much slower than average across the interior due to a cooler pattern during the early spring, and that'll promote a late start to their fire season there. Looking at precipitation over the past 60 or 90 days, going all the way down to the past 2 weeks. Over the past 90 days, you can see across California, Nevada, Utah, getting into Oregon, it's been drier to much drier than average. However, looking at the 30-day map and then the 14-day map, you can see a change towards slightly wetter conditions, although there are still some dry spots there on that California-Oregon state line area. to keep an eye on, but for all intents and purposes across the west, it hasn't been too bad. On the east slopes of the Washington Cascades, get into the northern Rockies, and then across western Montana, north central Montana, and southeastern Montana, northern Wyoming area, over the past 2 weeks, it's been quite dry. I expect that there's probably going to be some relief in that over the next couple of weeks, so I'm not too concerned about that. However, long-term trends do suggest that there could be some drought emergence or intensification ongoing in spite of the precipitation that we are currently getting and will be getting over the next week. Looking at the correlation between precipitation over the past month and temperatures, you can see some pretty interesting things setting up along the Gulf Coast, especially in Florida, where conditions have been much drier than average. Some areas have not received precipitation in more than a month. Temperatures, meanwhile, have been above average across the state, and as you go along the rim of the northern Gulf Coast, you can see it's been below average on precipitation and above average, significantly so, on temperatures. Looking westward across central West Texas, going into New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California, generally speaking, precipitation has been average to well above average. Some areas receiving as much as 400% of average or more over the past 30 days. Temperatures, meanwhile, have been closer to average within a couple of degrees either way. Along the West Coast, you can see overall below average temperatures over the past 30 days, with temperatures generally being between about 3 and 6 degrees below average, as a trough has lingered right on the West Coast for the better part of the last 2 or 3 weeks. Taking a look at drought conditions, there are several interesting things to point out on these maps. Let's start with the U.S. Drought Monitor on the upper left. Basically, the entire West Coast is under some degree of drought stress, showing at least abnormally dry conditions all the way up to moderate to severe drought. Those drought conditions, again, have been slowly expanding over the last couple of weeks, and we'll probably take a little pause on that over the next few weeks as they remain in that moist pattern, but that trend towards increasing and intensifying drought should resume late April into May as warm and dry conditions re-emerge over the western states. Looking at the drought change maps in the upper right corner, that shows what drought's been doing over the past 4 weeks. And if you look across the western states, those yellows and oranges indicate that the drought has been intensifying and expanding. Gray areas indicate where the drought's just basically persisted. The green shadings indicate where drought has been decreasing or being removed. So you can see across South Texas and Florida has been increasing, but current precipitation and expected precipitation across South Texas is probably going to lead to some areas of drought removal or at least reduction down there, but Florida is going to persist for a while longer. Looking in the bottom left, you have the calculated soil moisture anomaly continuing to show very dry soils across California, getting into western Nevada, going up through central and western Oregon, and then east of the Cascade Crest in Washington, going into the Idaho Panhandle, northwestern Montana, etc. That could be a little bit problematic as we head towards our fire season. So beneath that snowpack, you got dry soils, and that, again, is something for us to monitor going forward. You can see Florida being in bad shape. South Texas is bad there, but it is improving. Colorado has some dry spots, but when you factor in all the other things we look at when assessing fire potential, they're not in bad shape at all in Colorado, although southeastern Colorado will be a little bit dry for the next few weeks. The lower right image shows the seasonal drought outlook, basically expecting for there to be drought expansion across parts of the west, and there's really not too much more to say on that. Looking at Eddy, Eddy is basically another indice that we've been using the last couple of years. It looks at the thirst of the vegetation across the country. It's a good indicator of drought stress in that vegetation. Basically, along the West Coast, you see some areas where the vegetation is a little bit stressed, which coincides with that soil moisture map that we were just talking about. But this area that you see here is greatly reduced from what we've been seeing over the past couple of months. Those blue shaded areas are areas where it's quite moist and there aren't any significant concerns. So much of the west is looking good. It's just that area, central northern California, western Oregon, Columbia Basin area, that's a little bit of a concern. Looking in the east, you can see Florida under quite a bit of stress, the mid-Atlantic states as well. and areas along the rim of the Gulf Coast, which are currently starting to green up. Over the past 72 hours, we've actually had some impactful precipitation that will be a factor in assessing at least our short to mid-term fire potential across the country, so I went ahead and threw this slide in. Looking along the west coast, that area highlighted by that green oval that I overlaid is showing a good bit of precipitation extending as far south as northern portions of Southern California. Sierra picking up some precip. The Cascades and the western slopes of the Cascades picking up precip as well. Northern Rockies doing well, Idaho doing well. And interestingly, the precip across Nevada has been impactful too, but for a different reason. So what this means is most of that precip is fallen as snow, and that's helping with the snowpack. But of course, in the lower elevations, a lot of that is rain. And that precip that you see in Nevada and into Utah too, that's probably going to help lead to the growth and development of another significant grass crop in those areas. And of course, that would be the third year in a row, and that could be a little bit problematic later on when those fuels dry and cure out. Looking across south in Texas and eastern Texas, they've gotten some decent precipitation over the past 72 hours, especially over the last 24, and that should help slow down and ease some of the fire potential there. But take a look at Florida. Again, that just keeps remaining dry. They are going to get a little bit of rain today, which is the last day of March, but that's going to be probably it for precipitation for the next 2 weeks for the state. So keep an eye on Florida, especially the southern part of Florida. I think fire potential there is going to be mostly elevated for the better part of the next month. Elsewhere across the country, we're not too concerned. Central southern Minnesota picking up some precip, eastern portions of South Dakota. There are some dry spots in North Dakota that have been dry for the last month or two that we should keep an eye on until they green up. Same holds true for southeastern Montana and northern Wyoming. Looking at precipitation forecast for the next week, here's what we have. Very timely on that precip across the Cascades, the Siskiyous, and the High Sierra. That's going to help out with the snowpack there. Lower elevations picking up some rain in the Columbia Basin. Also in Nevada, Utah, and southern Idaho. That again is going to help with the growth and development of another healthy grass crop. Looking at Texas, they're going to remain under a fairly wet pattern for the eastern and southern half of the state. That's going to continue to help out with the fuels there, but across Florida, it's going to remain mostly dry. The precip that you see on this map here, again, is basically just short-term precipitation that's expected today. Again, after that, they are going to be dry for the foreseeable future. And let's take a look at the outlook maps. So we're looking at CPC's outlook maps for the next 8 to 14 days, basically looking at this plus the other model data that I look at for the next week. It suggests that for the next 2 weeks, the West is going to be stuck under basically the same pattern that they currently are facing, with overall cooler and moister than average conditions, whereas the East is going to be warmer than average, and also along the Gulf Coast being much warmer than average, with generally above normal precipitation. Unfortunately, that dry signal continues to be manifest in all the data for Florida, especially southern Florida, so the fire potential down there is going to remain elevated for the foreseeable future. Then looking at the long-term outlooks for the months of May, June, and July, you can see a little bit of a pattern flip there. The best long-range data that we have available to us suggests that we may see that switch flip sometime in late April to where we start seeing more ridging over the west, which would promote overall warmer than average conditions, and also drier than average conditions, not only across the Pacific Northwest, which it is showing, but over the west in general. In the east, that would tend to promote a little bit more troughing, which would tend to promote more precipitation, and that could help out Florida, finally start giving them a little bit more precipitation. Also, they'll start seeing the onset of their little tropical breezes season where they start getting afternoon convection, which drops a little bit of rain, so they could gradually improve even without the development of a trough during this stretch. So summarizing things by region as we go across the country, again, Alaska's in great shape mostly. Again, we're still watching the Kenai Peninsula and the Matsu Valley. But in the interior, with that heavy snowpack and those cool conditions, a late melt is expected and therefore a late start to their fire season there. But could see it have a little bit of holdover activity across the Kenai Peninsula from last year. But again, overall, normal conditions are expected for the fire season in Alaska following a mostly late start. Looking to the Pacific Northwest, the recent pattern has provided short to mid-term relief. But with that reemergence of the warm, dry pattern later in the spring, the prognosis is going to be for a busy season, especially across southern and southwestern Oregon. Looking towards California and the Southwest and Southern California are in great shape right now. They've gotten a lot of good precipitation. Soil moistures look fine. They're getting a good green up, but they're going to get a very heavy green up, a very dense grass crop, especially across northern Arizona and extending north into the southern Great Basin. That's going to be the third year in a row of a heavy grass crop. So when that stuff dries and cures out, that could become a concern. Northern California is going to be a concern as well once they decide to start drying out, once we start getting some ridging there. Again, those soil moistures are pretty dry. Even if the snowpack recovers, it will probably end up coming off earlier than average, but at least the recent wet pattern should push back the start date of the busiest part of their fire season to more of a average timeline, as opposed to the sooner than average timeline that we are looking at developing in the previous outlook discussions. As far as the Great Basin goes, a full green up is expected. Recent and expected precipitation in the lower elevations is going to lead to a robust grass crop across much of the region, especially central and southern portions of the region. Again, for this region as well, this is the third consecutive year of a good heavy grass crop. Again, that could become a little bit problematic come June and July. The monsoon is expected to be on time in the southwest, so southern portions of the region will probably exit their season in a typical fashion, but northern portions of the region you could have a little bit more concern from increased lightning activity should the monsoon be a little bit more active than what we're expecting. Looking up into the northern Rockies, snowpack is average to above average entering the spring, but a fast melting rate is expected by May. The dry conditions are slowly emerging across Idaho and western Montana. That's probably even considering the recent wet pattern that we're in, but because the overall pattern has been drier than average, it's not looking terribly so, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on as we move into mid to late spring when we start seeing that ridge developing. So you could have some areas that are quite active this summer across western portions of the northern Rockies region. Looking to the Rocky Mountains, basically average. Region-wide is looking pretty good, except for up there in northern Wyoming where it's been drier than average, but they will be greening up soon. Snowpack is average. Southeastern Colorado's got a few dry spots to monitor until they green up. As far as above normal potential goes, we're just not seeing it right now. Could see maybe a little bit of elevated activity across southwestern Colorado, but that's becoming common. And if it does pick up there, they're going to be under the influences of the monsoon by early July, so that would shut them down. Looking at eastern area and southern area, we're not too concerned. The upper Midwest is drier than average, but they have gotten some recent precipitation. So I think that prior to green up, they might be okay. Southern area, we're not really concerned about any areas other than Florida, and we've talked about that in detail. And Florida will continue to be a concern into late April before relief arrives. So looking at our progression into the fire season, April and May look pretty good. We're basically dealing with the green up occurring. Most area regions are going to remain out of season. You might start seeing Alaska, at least portions of south central Alaska entering fire season come late May. And maybe start seeing portions of the Southwest starting to pick up in activity as well. But for all intents and purposes, most the regions are going to remain out of season during that stretch. As we get into June, and that warmer and drier than average patterns takes firmer hold over the west, we'll start seeing fire activity increase. Snowpack melting rates will accelerate, and the higher elevations will go through their green up process as well, and fuse will begin to dry out. And some areas will probably start seeing becoming receptive to fire, especially across portions of central and northern California and southwestern Oregon by late in the month. And then July, we should be full on into fire season in the west. The monsoon should arrive the first week of the month in the southwest and gradually shut the season down there, whereas other areas across the west will start picking up in activity and possibly significantly so. As you look north to Alaska, precipitation will start arriving in the state probably around mid-month, and their fire season will slowly end. Overall in Alaska, you're looking at an average, maybe even potentially below average fire season up that way. And finally, these are the latest outlook maps that will be issued on April 1st. Basically, for April, overall, average to below average conditions expected across the southeast, extending north into the Ohio River Valley. Again, for April, below average across much of Alaska as the snowpack comes off. Looking ahead to May, you start seeing some pockets of potential above normal activity in portions of southeastern Arizona in the desert, as you get a pretty good grass crop drying and curing out. Southern Florida has some elevated potential as well, at least early in the month. Looking ahead to June, you can see more pockets of above normal potential coming into play as that grass crop dries and cures out. Along the California coast, maybe some below normal potential due to persistent onshore flow, which would promote higher humidities there and therefore maybe a decreased fire potential in early summer. And then moving forward to July, you can see the potential for above normal activity expanding northward to include portions of Oregon, Washington. You also see it increasing across Utah and Northern California and northwestern Nevada. This briefing is for the benefit of our partnering land management agencies and firefighters across the country. Please feel free to share this site with your colleagues, and I'll record this briefing weekly, giving updates to developing conditions, and I appreciate you listening. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to contact me, Brian Henry at rbhenry@blm.gov. Or if you have location-specific questions, contact your local predictive services staff. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.